Another basic building block of civilization and warfare is the ship. Boats have been used to fish, trade and transport along rivers and across the seas for millennia. From the 2nd millennium BC come records of ships to transport troops to battle. Oared vessels also carried catapults and rams to attack other vessels, oarsmen often doubling as soldiers. The Egyptians, the Hittites and Assyrian empires all crossed the seas to do battle. And when they weren't fighting each other, they would use their vessels for trade and exploration, and perhaps a little piracy. From the Mediterranean as far-flung as the Chinese to the east and the Nordic races to the north, all developed both shallow and deep-water vessels in search of trade and to extend their field of influence. Organized attack forces first appeared in Cretan times in the Aegean Sea, the time of Homer and Troy. From the 7th and 6th centuries BC, formal navies appeared with both standardized ships and tactics. The Phoenicians developed multi-decked vessels. Early Greek references show ships from 20 to 50 oars. The biremes were 80 feet long by 10 feet wide with 2 sets of oars each side. The triremes had 3. Assyrian and Egyptian navies armed their vessels with rams, boarding hooks, and missile-throwing catapults and trebuchets. The Athenians were particularly good at the ramming technique. There are numerous tales of great Mediterranean battles: the Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC, the battle at Aegospotami that decided the Peloponnesian War of 405 BC. The developing Roman Empire required a fleet to rule the Mediterranean in 70 BC. The Battle of Actium during the Roman Civil Wars of 31 BC saw the demise of Mark Antony and solidified the empire won. Coastal skirmishes by invading tribes to Britain continued for centuries. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 required sea power. From medieval times, the concept of this sea power was not lost on the small island nation of Britain, which came to rely on it not just for survival, but also its future as a kingdom. The cog of the 10th century was a small, simple sailing vessel with a single mast used throughout the coastal Atlantic and Mediterranean seas. It was a square-rigged vessel that became the antecedent of most fighting vessels. The advent of gunpowder and cannon changed not only warfare forever, but also ship design. The ancient galley, which could rely on both wind and oar power, had to be adapted to take on these heavy and bulky cannons. The man-of-war had its oars replaced with cannons, which meant the vessel had to rely solely on sail power. This quickly required the need for more masts to hold more canvas. So a mainmast, usually in the center of the boat, had a foremast added, then a mizzenmast behind the mainmast, and the Bonaventure mast, or the fourth mast on some vessels, added to the stern. The carrack was developed in the Atlantic with 3 and sometimes 4 masts. They had a high, rounded stern with an aft castle, held over from the days of bow and arrow, and a bowsprit at the bow. It was this type of vessel that took explorers all over the globe in search of new lands. The carrack evolved into the galleon and the ship of the line. Henry VIII is often cited as the man who gave birth to the British Navy. He invested heavily in shipbuilding and purchased all the cannon he could get his hands on to arm his fleet. With the powers of Europe vying against the small island nation, Henry built a powerful, well-trained navy. Bigger galleons could hold more cannon, and as such Henry commissioned many great vessels like the Mary Rose and built the Portsmouth Naval Base. The Battle of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was principally between galleons of various sizes. The Ark Raleigh, later the Ark Royal, was designed by Sir Walter Raleigh to lead the Armada against the Spanish. Other notable ships of the time were the Golden Hind of Sir Francis Drake and the largest Elizabethan galleon, the Triumph, flagship of Sir Martin Frobisher in the Battle of the Spanish Armada. In 1626, the biggest and grandest warship yet built, the Vasa, was laid down for the King of Sweden. The Vasa sank after only 1 mile of its maiden voyage. Brand new and fully laden with cannon, Attempts were made to salvage it, but it lay undisturbed until 1961. More than 200 feet long, armed with 64 guns on 2 decks, the ship was the pride of Sweden's growing empire and a new deadly weapon in the war with Poland. But within minutes of leaving the harbour, and to the horror of the tens of thousands of onlookers gathered on Stockholm's shores, it began heeling dangerously. Water rushed in through the open gun decks, and the Vasa sank, killing 30 of the 150 sailors on board. Nearly 4 centuries after it sank, one of the most magnificent war history treasures faces a second tragedy. Slowly but surely, it is turning to dust. Sulfur, slowly absorbed by the wood while the Vasa had been lying on a seabed, has prevented it for centuries from being eaten by microorganisms. When the Vasa was lifted, sulfur came into contact with the air and began to turn slowly into sulfuric acid. Accelerated by oxygen produced by the rusting iron bolts and humidity, the fatal reaction is believed to have already produced 5,000 tons of acid, which corrodes the wood. Swedish and American scientists, headed by Magnus Sandström, professor of structural chemistry at Stockholm University, have now discovered that 80% of the ship and the wooden objects it contains have suffered some degree of acid attack.
In less than 2 years, we have come from no visible damage to about 1,000 visible spots of acid on the surface of the Vasa. Salt precipitation or acidic soft wood.
Vasa's interior has already been treated with a solution to temporarily reduce the impact of the acid.
Oh, it's falling apart as well. This is definitely not good. Very, very soft. And he'll just disappear into the wood without strength from me.
This is elemental sulfur, the stuff that we have about 2,000 kilos of in the wood of the Vasa. The Vasa is going to be saved, but as I said, it's a battle against time, and piece by piece it will deteriorate if we do not do what we must.
A plan has also been drawn up to replace the 8,500 iron bolts used to rebuild the ship. However, the more permanent solution is yet to be found. With the use of these types of ships to explore the New World and establish control of far-flung countries, the ability to defend and project military power across vast distances was wholly proven by the British Navy in 1782. During the American War of Independence, their force of 36 ships of the line was able to engage and defeat a French naval force of 33 ships in the West Indies. The French lost 1 ship sunk, 5 captured, and 8,000 sailors wounded or dead. Horatio Nelson, somewhat closer to home, was also able to prove British naval might dominated the seas with superior ship design and training. At the Battle of the Nile, August 1798, he effectively destroyed the French fleet anchored off Alexandria, burning 3 ships and capturing 9 others. His ship from 1803 was the HMS Victory, a first-rate ship of the line of 3,500 tons. In total, she was 227 feet long, with a beam of 51 foot 10 inches. From water's edge to the tip of her main mast, she was 205 feet tall, with a hull thickness of 2 feet at the waterline. With a crew of 850, she carried over 102 cannon of various caliber from 12 to 68 pounders and participated in several major battles, successfully, as she is now a museum in Portsmouth, England. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 saw Nelson and the Victory once again dominate the French and Spanish with a decisive engagement of 27 ships of the line and 6 smaller vessels against a combined French-Spanish fleet of 33 ships of the line and 8 other vessels. Deemed one of the greatest naval battles of the 19th century, the British destroyed 1 ship and captured 21 others, causing 12,781 casualties to their own number of 1,695 killed or wounded including Nelson himself. During this time of sail, several specific types of vessel were standard, like gunboats, sloops, and schooners. The brig vessel was a two-master with square rigging. Small and maneuverable, they were war vessels for lakes and confined waterways. The corvette was a small, lightly armed vessel. Usually with a single deck and used mainly for coastal work, it was bigger than a sloop of war but smaller than a frigate. The frigate referred to many types of vessel over the years, but specifically they were as long as a ship of the line, but square-rigged on all three masts, and generally lightly armed for patrol and escort duties. The ship of the line was the largest and most well-armed of vessels able to be part of the line of battle within a fleet, hence the name battleship. These smaller vessels proved their worth during the War of 1812 and on the waterways of North America. On Lake Champlain, September 1814, the British were soundly defeated by the United States when one frigate, one brig, 2 sloops and 12 gunboats of the Royal Navy met US forces of a frigate, a brig, a schooner, a sloop, and 10 gunboats. Britain lost all 4 major vessels with 388 casualties. Time was changing. The early Industrial Revolution was bringing new technology to the fore. 2 innovations were about to change naval vessels forever: steam for propulsive power and the ironclad hull. With the advent of steam power, a flurry of new vessels were built, propulsion system, although they generally included masts and rigging just in case of mechanical breakdowns. It also provided an answer to river travel, where the wind was often either unhelpful or absent for sail-powered vessels. The general design was of the paddle wheel, and it wasn't until the introduction of the screw propeller in the 1840s that steam power became really practical on board a warship. The British Navy excelled in producing these screw-type vessels. The French Navy experimented with ironclad batteries. Basically armoured wooden hulls with heavy armaments used to attack shore batteries, they were towed and little resembled any ship. About this same time came the development of the explosive shell. The wood-hulled warship was doomed. The great navies of Britain, France, Russia and the United States all rearmed their vessels with the larger 32 to 42-pounder guns with explosive shells. To counter this technological edge, cladding the timber hulls with iron or steel became prevalent. These ironclads quickly outnumbered timber-only hulls. The first ocean-going ironclad was the French La Gloire of 1858. The British countered with a frigate, the HMS Warrior. Steam-powered and all iron, she was fitted with the latest in steam engines capable of over 14 knots. It was not long before these ironclads would come to exchange blows. It was 1860 during the US Civil War. The ISS Virginia was making quick work of the timber-hulled Union vessels off Sewell's Point, near the mouth of Hampton Roads, Virginia. The Virginia sank or damaged 3 frigates with over 450 casualties. The Virginia withdrew to conduct repairs, and the following day returned to find the ironclad USS Monitor had also arrived, whereupon the famous Duel of the Ironclads began. The outcome was inconclusive, although the Monitor had superior firepower and was able to crack the hull of the Virginia. Either way, the future of naval warfare was decidedly in their favor. The Stonewall was the United States Confederacy's last ironclad vessel. It was sold to a small island nation wishing to build naval forces. It was renamed the Kotetsu, which literally translated as ironclad, later renamed the Azuma, and became of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Upheavals and the threat of independence in Cuba had the Americans send the USS Maine to show the flag and, if necessary, protect American interests. The battleship arrived in Havana January 25, 1898. On February 15th at 9:40 p.m., a massive explosion ripped through the battleship's magazine and sank her where she lay anchored. 266 men lost their lives. After numerous investigations, it was found a mine had struck the battleship and ignited its own magazine. The incident led directly to the short American-Spanish War, where the United States flexed its naval muscle and took all of the remaining Spanish territories. The protected cruiser, the Olympia, and 5 other warships steamed into Manila Bay, Philippines, and destroyed the 10-ship Spanish force there. The cruiser USS Charleston sailed to Guam, fired 1 shot at the island, and took possession from a handful of ill-equipped Spanish soldiers. The United States was becoming a force to be reckoned with. The Japanese Navy kept a close watch on the US as it spread its power into the Pacific, taking territory from the Old World and expanding its bases across to Asia. The US could easily affect the sea trade of island nations like Japan. With their expansion into Manchuria and Korea with the first Sino-Japanese conflict of 1894, the Japanese were building a naval force comparable to the mighty European forces. They flexed this force in 1904 against the mighty Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur. With a preemptive strike utilizing the small torpedo boat, the Japanese Navy attacked the Russian fleet at anchor and then blockaded it in Port Arthur. Russia sent assistance in the form of the Russian Baltic Fleet. Redubbed the 2nd Pacific Squadron, Admiral Rozhestvensky sailed the massive fleet around the globe to relieve the Pacific forces. But when they reached the Sea of Japan, they met the Japanese fleet. At the Battle of Tsushima, or the Sea of Japan, the Japanese devastated the Russian fleet in one of the great sea battles of naval warfare. A peace treaty was quickly arranged by the United States and signed in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Russia ceded a great deal of land and influence, not to mention the public humiliation. The Battle of the Sea of Japan was closely watched by Britain and the United States. They too learned a lesson in tactics and vessel design. The result was the new Dreadnought-class battleship. Britain was determined to remain the major power of the 7 seas and embarked on a new ship design. Launched in 1906 from Portsmouth shipyards, the Dreadnought weighed over 18,000 tons, was 527 feet long, and thanks to the new steam turbine engine, could reach a speed of 21 knots. She was a big gun concept vessel. To counter the threat of torpedoes, larger guns could engage enemies further away before they could launch a torpedo attack. She was armed with 10 12-inch guns, 27 12-pounders and 5 torpedo tubes, and armor up to 11 inches thick. The Dreadnought set the benchmark for naval fighting vessels. Quickly, the United States, Germany and others began to equip themselves with this new caliber of vessel. With the outbreak of World War I, there were surprisingly few battleship engagements. The big game seemed to occur under the water. Part of the battle lay in the shipyards being able to manufacture and produce warships faster than the enemy could sink them. Also, being able to supply an island nation with food and equipment required safe passage of transport vessels. The German U-boat menace had not been anticipated to the extent that it was used to sink merchant vessels and stalk the seas unseen. Great effort had to be put into neutralizing this menace. Light, fast vessels patrolled convoys of merchant shipping. In the whole of the First World War, only 1 U-boat was sunk by a Dreadnought-class battleship, and that was by ramming. The destroyer was further developed to hunt and destroy at first torpedo boats, but now this new threat of submarines. They were equipped with hydrophones and depth chargers. The first sub-kill by a destroyer occurred in October 1914, when the Badger rammed the German submarine, the U-19. It was only disabled. In November, the Gary sank U-18, and December saw the first U-boat sunk with a depth charge from the Llewellyn. Another weapon in the anti-submarine arsenal was the aeroplane, sent out to look for them and, if possible, engage them with either bombs or torpedoes. The price paid was heavy, including the sinking of the luxury ocean liner, the RMS Lusitania. Sunk off Ireland by the German U-boat U-20 in May 1915, it is considered to be one of the reasons for the USA's entering the war. Of major surface battles, there were few engagements like the one in the southern Atlantic, where German cruisers attacked British vessels off the coast of Coronel, Chile, destroying half the vessels and killing over 1,500. It was the first British naval loss since 1812, and the response was swift. Less than a month later, near the Falkland Islands, a British fleet of 8 vessels sought out the Germans responsible. They engaged 8 cruisers and transport vessels, sinking the majority. A light cruiser and a transport ship managed to get away. The British suffered 29 casualties, compared to 2,000 Germans killed or captured. There was the Battle of Dogger Bank, where a British force of battle cruisers and destroyers chased down a German fleet of cruisers and destroyers, sinking one cruiser and damaging another. It was a minor tactical win for Britain, not the engagement they had sought, and many battle procedures and commanders were changed after the event. The Battle of Jutland was the biggest battle of the war, and the only one fought with battleships. Conducted in the North Sea near Denmark, it was an indecisive engagement between 28 British battleships, 43 cruisers, and 78 destroyers, to Germany's 16 battleships, 22 cruisers, and 61 torpedo boats. After heavy and prolonged engagement, Britain lost 14 vessels, including 6 cruisers, to Germany's 11 ships. Both lost many lives. The Germans returned to port under the cover of darkness and were unable to defeat the British fleet. The rest of the war turned to submarine warfare, and the British battleships remained in the North Sea, held any further German fleet attacks, but none eventuated. After the war, battle-weary nations made few changes to their navies, but increased their sizes and developed some new anti-submarine tactics. The US continued to expand their forces.
We get a good view of the mighty Tennessee down there, and the Colorado, waiting for their orders to sail as part of the great fleet under the command of Admiral R.H. Lay, in charge of the battle fleet, 9 dreadnoughts and 56 other ships, including the airplane carrier Lexington, packed to the gunwales with a collection of Eagles, and they certainly look ready for business, whatever it may be. The fleet has secret orders to meet somewhere in the Pacific to take part in the maneuvers off Hawaii. And the whole country's buzzing with the rumors about where they're really going. Somehow, these magnificent battle wagons always give you a thrill just to look at them. The California, the proud flagship of the Pacific Fleet.
There was one development, however, that would see another major change in naval battles of the future: the aircraft carrier. Balloon carriers were first used in the late 19th and early 20th centuries for floating observation balloons. With the invention of the fixed-wing airplane by the Wright brothers in 1903, it took less than 7 years for a plane to be flown off the bow of a naval vessel. Getting off the vessel was relatively easy, but landing on one less so. So seaplanes were the common answer, creating seaplane tenders like the Japanese Wakamiya in 1907 and the HMS Engadine in 1911. The first successful landing occurred on the USS Pennsylvania in January 1911. The HMS Ark Royal was the first of the modern aircraft carriers. Equipped with a seaplane and 2 regular aircraft, this hybrid saw action in the Dardanelles campaign of 1914. HMS Argus was the first fitted with a full-length aircraft deck. By 1922, several navies had acquired aircraft carriers. The USS Langley was the United States' first carrier, modified from the collier Jupiter in 1920. It was 542 feet long, and displaced 11,500 tons with a top speed of 15 knots. She carried 55 aircraft and a complement of 468 officers and men. She was also armed with 4 5-inch guns. The Langley was by all means a complete aircraft carrier with a launch catapult, aircraft hangar and maintenance bays below deck, and a carrier pigeon coop. Carrier pigeons were sometimes used by seaplanes to communicate back to base. One sideline of interest is that the original vessel, the collier Jupiter, had 3 sister ships, the USS Cyclops, Proteus, and Nereus. The Cyclops apparently disappeared March 1918 in the Bermuda Triangle. The Proteus and Nereus also disappeared in 1941, following the same route taken by the Cyclops, their fates unknown. However, the Langley's fate is known. In 1936, she was converted to a seaplane tender and served during the Second World War in the South Pacific as part of the Australian-American-Dutch command forces, where she hunted submarines out of Darwin and also ferried aircraft from Perth, Western Australia. On 27 February 1942, she was hit by Japanese bombers south of Java. Aircraft on board was set alight and the engine room was flooded. To avoid being taken by the enemy, she was sunk by her escorts. With most navies equipped by 1932 with various types of aircraft carrier, their power would not be tested until the Second World War. Only then would their capabilities be realized, in particular in the Pacific arena, where aircraft carriers would come to dominate the battlefield even more than the mighty battleship had in the past. September 1st, 1939, Gdansk, Poland. The pocket battleship Schleswig-Holstein begins shelling the port garrison at Gdansk, initiating the Battle of Westerplatte and the beginning of the Second World War. The first major sea battle takes place 13th December in the same year in the South Atlantic off the River Plate estuary, Argentina. The German battleship Admiral Graf Spee was sinking merchant shipping in the Atlantic. A British and Commonwealth heavy cruiser and 2 light cruisers located her and attacked. All 4 vessels were heavily damaged, and after an extended fight, the Spree led smoke and fled for the neutral port of Montevideo. After much political wrangling and subterfuge, it was eventually scuttled in the estuary. When France fell to the Germans, Britain had little choice but to ensure their former allies' fleet did not fall in German hands, and conducted Operation Catapult on 3rd July 1940. British forces, including the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, the battlecruiser Hood, the battleships Valiant and Resolution, 3 cruisers and 11 destroyers, attacked the strongest portion of the French fleet at the port of Mers el Kebir in French Algeria. For the loss of 4 aircraft, Britain sank 1 battleship, heavily damaged 2 others, and 4 destroyers. 2 years later, the rest of the French fleet that could not join Allied forces was scuttled by their crews to stop Germany gaining control of their vessels. The German battleship Bismarck would become one of the best-known battleships of the war. Launched in July 1939, and although through treaties not allowed to exceed 35,000 tons, she displaced 41,700 tons and was then the biggest warship of the time. She was 823 feet long with a beam of 118 feet. Powered by 12 high-pressure turbines and 3 props, she could reach speeds of 30.1 knots. Her officers and crew totaled 2,092. Her main armament was 8 380mm guns, 12 152mm, and 16 105mm, as well as various other anti-aircraft guns. She also carried 4 aircraft. Her first engagement was with the British battlecruiser Hood and Prince of Wales, in which the Hood was hit several times, including the magazine, which blew the vessel in 2 and sank it within minutes. The Prince of Wales also suffered heavy damage. It was after this engagement that Churchill famously said, "Sink the Bismarck." A task force was set up, and the Bismarck hunted relentlessly. Its rudder was disabled by an aircraft torpedo and then attacked by destroyer-launched torpedoes. The Bismarck finally succumbed, and although there is still controversy over whether she was scuttled or not, she sank. The true capabilities of an aircraft carrier were finally demonstrated at Pearl Harbor on December 17, 1941. In a preemptive strike, Japanese forces launched 2 air attacks on US battleships and other vessels at the Hawaiian Naval Station. Of 8 US battleships, 3 were sunk immediately, 1 capsized, and the rest were heavily damaged. 3 light cruisers and 3 destroyers were also sunk. Fortunately for the US, their 3 aircraft carriers were not in port at the time. This attack, of course, led to the United States entering the Second World War. The war in the Pacific had begun. Life aboard these giant aircraft carriers was a world of its own, as documented during the war by filmmakers. This particular film, titled The Fighting Lady, revealed some of the unique culture that had developed on a flight deck.
As our planes come aboard, there begins an operation almost as exciting as the attack itself. A ballet after battle, with the plane directors as dancing masters. The whirling propellers fill this scene with danger, but now our crews are trained and adept. The landing signal officer performs an eloquent adagio on the Fighting Lady's stern. Warning to the rest of the cast to stay off stage until a limping member can be led out of the way. Pilots go below to report to their combat intelligence officers. They have hot news, good news. They tell what they saw and did, how many rounds of ammunition they fired, how many bombs they dropped, what they hit, what they noticed at the target that was new and different or that may need hitting again. As the reports are added up and our combat photographers develop their pictures, the story becomes better and better. Every single Jap bomber on Marcus has been destroyed. 80% of the shore installations blasted or set afire.
The Battle of the Coral Sea occurred over several days in May of 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy was attempting to land troops on New Guinea in an attempt to take Port Moresby. However, fielded against them were the United States and Australian naval forces. This was the first time aircraft carriers faced off against each other, and remarkably the first time in naval history that at no time did either fighting vessel actually see the other or exchange shots directly. Although a tactical loss for the Allies, it was a strategic win, inasmuch as the Japanese abandoned their attempt to land troops and take Port Moresby. Both forces launched aircraft in search, often missing each other due to cloud cover or poor intelligence work. Finally, US aircraft found the invasion fleet and sank the small carrier Shoho with a great loss of life. It was the first Allied success against a major Japanese surface vessel. The following day, a second Japanese carrier was damaged. Japanese aircraft found the US fleet and hit both their aircraft carriers. The Lexington had to be abandoned and scuttled. The second and greater carrier battle took place off the island of Midway in the Central Pacific in June 1942. Due to faultless naval intelligence and interception of coded messages, the US were able to gather their forces in the right place at the right time. The Japanese, on the other hand, misjudged their opposition so badly they did not believe there was an aircraft carrier nearby at all. The battle lasted over a period of 2 days, but most of the damage was done in minutes. American losses included the Yorktown and her escort destroyer. 132 planes were shot down, with a total of 307 casualties. The Japanese fleet, however, suffered greater loss. 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 275 planes, and 3,500 men in the course of 5 minutes. This battle effectively ended the Japanese domination of the Pacific with their air power. 19th and 20th June 1944, near the Marianas Islands, the United States Fifth Fleet engaged the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet. In total, there were 24 aircraft carriers and 12 battleships, 122 other vessels, and over 1,756 planes involved. In the aftermath, the US had lost a total of 123 planes, whereas the Japanese lost 3 carriers and an oiler sunk, 6 other ships heavily damaged, and 600 planes lost. After this engagement, the Japanese were unable to replace the aircraft and pilots lost, and remaining carriers were often without sufficient aircraft. The Battle of Leyte Gulf and the retaking of the Philippines was a defining moment in the war, as the results ended the Imperial Japanese Navy and ensconced the United States as the most powerful naval force in the world. The actual battle was several major actions over several days and involved several battle groups and land-based aircraft. It also introduced the suicide kamikaze attack to naval warfare, pilots specially prepared to crash their explosive-laden planes into capital ships. The first ship struck by a Japanese plane, although not an official kamikaze pilot, was the Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Australia. A 200-kilogram bomb on the plane failed to detonate, perhaps saving the ship further damage and loss of life. However, the Australia was struck several more times by kamikaze and forced to retire from this battle. The kamikaze were more successful against several USS carriers and heavy vessels. The end disposition of the Imperial Navy was the loss of 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers and a sub. All the surviving surface vessels were damaged. The US lost 3 carriers and 3 destroyers, including 200 planes and over 2,800 casualties. This was to be the last great carrier-based battle of the war. The war was nearing an end. However, many more battles were fought, getting to and invading Okinawa. It was the intervention of the Manhattan Project that helped end hostilities. With the surrender of Japan, the United States was left with a surplus of naval hardware, including German and Japanese vessels and several redundant aircraft carriers. But they found a use for them as targets. Operation Crossroads, conducted at Bikini Atoll, detonated 2 bombs. The first was airdropped and sank the Japanese cruiser Sakawa and 4 US ships. The second underwater detonation sank the Japanese battleship Nagato and the US battleship Arkansas, and 4 more US vessels, including the aircraft carrier Saratoga and 2 other major vessels.
The next scene is a spectacular aerial view. The aircraft carrier Saratoga, grand old fighting lady, sank as a result of heavy underwater hull damage.
Even these massive vessels were no match for atomic weapons. One such blast could disable an entire naval force, and a rethink of the structure of future navies was recommended. The United States set about building bigger and better carriers, believing that air power was the key to future naval combat.
At Brooklyn Navy Yard, the new Queen of the Fleet is commissioned with top brass from the Secretary of the Navy on down, present for the notable occasion. Captain Robert Stroh takes command of the 60,000-ton carrier USS Saratoga, the biggest and most powerful vessel afloat. Special attention was given crewmen's comfort in her design, which also provided unmatched plane handling facilities, key to her striking power. The new Saratoga, 6th Navy vessel to bear the name, would dwarf her World War II namesake with its giant flight deck, 5 city blocks long, 1 block wide, and its complement of 100 jets and crew of 3,500. The greatest one-ship creation of naval power ever built. Truly the new Queen of the Seas.
There were also 2 new technologies developing that would dramatically influence ship design once again. They were nuclear reactors, small enough to fit on board a ship and provide an almost endless supply of energy for propulsion, and the guided missile that would be capable of replacing most naval armaments.
glimpse of the Navy of tomorrow, the USS Boston, America's first guided missile cruiser, in action off Cuba. From below deck magazines, its potent Terrier missiles are automatically positioned on launching racks. Ship and missile were designed for each other in what engineers call an integrated weapons system, lethally efficient. This cruiser mounts no big guns. One of its missiles can sink any enemy ship, or with an atom warhead, smash an enemy base.
Guided missiles were the answer to several problems for the modern fleet, but also a curse. One small, well-aimed missile could in theory hit a giant aircraft carrier with 100 aircraft aboard.
The nuclear-powered carrier Enterprise has joined the 7th Fleet off the Vietnam coast to lend added punch to the coastal patrol. The Enterprise will be joined by the nuclear-powered guided missile frigate Bainbridge to become the first nuclear-powered ships in history to enter combat. The Enterprise will be stationed off Saigon to launch planes for airstrikes against the Viet Cong in South Vietnam.
The strategy of fleet structure was evolving to a defense in depth. At the center, the supercarrier and aircraft capable of striking enemy targets with aircraft launch weapons and also air-to-air defense against enemy aircraft. The missile cruiser would target distant threats as well as providing surface-to-air missile capability. Another layer of picket vessels or frigates were geared toward anti-submarine operations to protect the fleet. Hastened by the Cold War, anti-ship missile development was rapid. The first use of a modern anti-ship missile saw Egypt fire a Soviet Styx missile that sank an Israeli destroyer in 1967. In 1973, Israeli and Syrian forces, both armed with anti-ship missiles, were engaged. The Syrian forces were sunk as the Israelis utilized anti-missile countermeasures. 1982 saw the conflict between Britain and Argentina over possession of the Falkland Islands. Once again proving the need for air defense, as two British vessels, the landing ships Sir Tristan and the Galahad, were each hit by bombs from Argentine fighters in Bluff Cove, causing severe casualties and the later scuttling of the Galahad. The Argentine Air Force was able to inflict severe damage on British naval vessels utilizing the French Exocet anti-ship missiles. The HMS Sheffield and container ship Atlantic Conveyor were both sunk, and the destroyer HMS Glamorgan seriously damaged. Each was hit by Exocet missiles. Another problem encountered was that the superstructures of these modern vessels were made of lightweight aluminium. It has a much lower burning temperature than traditional steel. Ship designers have gone back to the drawing board. New anti-missile defense systems were developed and installed on the modern ships. Standard missiles could shoot down an incoming missile, or the Phalanx close support machine gun could track and shoot down low-flying missiles. Electronic countermeasures, chaff and flare dispensers. However, none of the systems were either working or in operation aboard the USS Stark, a missile frigate. In 1987, whilst in the Persian Gulf, two Exocet missiles fired from an Iraqi jet fighter hit the ship, severely damaging her. October 2000, and the guided missile destroyer USS Cole was also hit and disabled, but this time by a small watercraft packed with explosives that rammed the side of the ship in a suicide attack. The Arleigh Burke-class Aegis-equipped vessel was at the time one of the most advanced destroyers afloat. Modern naval vessels are as diverse and sophisticated as ever, from aircraft carriers for fixed-wing aircraft to helicopter-only carriers. Smaller carriers, like the British design, utilize a ski jump at the end of the deck to aid in launching aircraft. A very dangerous place to live and work is the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. From the deafening roar of jet engines, the danger of turboprops spinning invisibly about, fully fueled and armed planes with high explosive missiles and armaments stacked along the edge of the narrow runway, plus a rolling deck, to make it a hazardous environment. To help aid a safe working relationship on the flight deck of a US aircraft carrier, the sailors wear different coloured shirts that designate their tasks. White shirts are responsible for general safety, red shirts handle munitions and bombs, purple shirts or grapes handle jet fuel, and green shirts handle the catapult and arresting gear that launch and retrieve the aircraft. Yellow shirts are responsible for directing aircraft on the deck. Even in peacetime, there are hazards in maintaining an aircraft carrier. There have at times in the past been very serious incidents on the flight deck. In one instance, in 1987 aboard the carrier Forrestal, a jet parked to the side of the runway accidentally fired an air-to-air missile that shot across the deck and hit several planes parked on the other side, instantly causing an explosion and fire. All the aircraft were fully fueled and laden with weapons.
There, on deck. Somehow a Zuni rocket has been triggered, roaring across the flight deck and hitting an A-4 Skyhawk. A sheet of flame from the A-4's ruptured fuel tank has enveloped the Skyhawk and her immediate neighbors. Behind that curtain of smoke, two 1,000-pound bombs have already dropped from her wings onto the burning deck, while only one hose is actually operating. Carries a message. The Forrestal is in deep trouble.
A fire at sea is the ultimate nightmare for any sailor because there is nowhere to run, especially on a vessel packed with aviation fuel, high explosive munitions, bombs and missiles.
Your instincts have to be right. Your courage pinned on like a badge. Following the third explosion, the first two fire parties had been virtually wiped out. The fire was not completely out of control. A great ship was on the verge of dying. To save her, other men were going to have to go back on deck, most of them without sufficient training in firefighting techniques.
The Forrestal fire taught many lessons, the least of which even one small missile penetrating the defences could knock out a supercarrier and her complement of aircraft. The Forrestal fire killed 134 and injured 161 sailors and aircrew, destroying 21 aircraft. The very same accident happened again in 1969 aboard the USS Enterprise. A Zuni rocket was triggered, causing a fire. 27 sailors were killed and 314 injured. 15 aircraft destroyed. Several countries continue to maintain an aircraft carrier-based naval force and are currently designing and building the next generation of them. Britain is constructing the Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carrier and is planning two, the first to be in service by 2014. Planned to be 280 meters in length with a beam of 39 meters with a crew of 600, she is expected to carry 36 F-35 Lightning II aircraft and 4 early warning aircraft. The United States, which currently maintains 12 supercarriers, the latest the USS George H.W. Bush, the last of the Nimitz class, has begun production of the next generation design, the Gerald R. Ford. This next generation ship will include a newly designed nuclear reactor and electromagnetic catapults with a reduced crew number. The ship itself is 1,092 feet long, with a beam of 134 feet. Capable of 30-plus knots and armed with surface-to-air missiles, she will carry 75-plus aircraft. 3 are planned to be put into service. New technology is always a strong influence on design. Stealth technology, first applied to aircraft, has been integrated into naval vessels for some time and looks to be an ever-increasing influence into the future. Designed and constructed as a test vessel in 1985, the Sea Shadow was not revealed to the public until 1993, Very few knew of its existence. Unarmed and never put into service, the vessel was a test to see if it could avoid radar and sonar detection. Several models and designs have been put into service. Not only sophisticated catamaran designs, several countries like Britain, France, Holland and Germany have frigates utilizing this technology to reduce their radar signature. Future designs intend to include stealth technology and reduce above waterline exposure, in some cases reminiscent of the Civil War ironclads. It seems that regardless of the vulnerability of large surface warships, there will continue to be these giants of the sea bristling with aircraft and rockets for years to come.